Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading chapters 35 and 36 of The American Slave Coast, The History of American Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're starting on page 514, The Slave Trade to Cuba and Brazil. And it starts with the words of Nicholas B. Trist, written in 1839, who said, "The fruit, thus far, of the measures against the slave trade has been the substitution of small, sharp, wet clippers for the large, clump, dry vessels of double and treble the tonnage, which would now be employed to transport the same number of persons. And there's no telling how far this process of reduction may be carried." At sundown on July 31st, 1834, some 775,000 enslaved people, though sources vary as to the exact number, in the British West Indies became free. Well, technically at least, though most remained as apprentices until 1838. 20 million pounds was allocated to compensate slave owners for their lost property. But the newly freed Afro Antillians were not paid compensation for their stolen labor or their stolen persons. Some 47,000 claimants filed for compensations as ex-slave owners. The 6% of them who were absentees received 8.2 million pounds, or 41% of the money. Britain's economy was large enough and diverse enough to be able to easily buy out the slave owners, something that would have been impossible in the American South. The end of slavery in Jamaica was followed by a sharp drop in sugar production there, subsequently cited by Southeasterners as a boilerplate cautionary tale. There was no production without the whip. Meanwhile, Cuban sugar planters, who continued using the whip, had their greatest opportunity since Saint Domingue disappeared from the market 40 years before. Cuba didn't have a domestic slave trade. Like every place else that raised sugar, the growth rate of its enslaved population was negative. Cuba's slave market clamored for more Africans. Now that Britain was no longer trying to stop American commerce and was pursuant to treaty respecting American vessels at sea, blockade runners and privateers were no longer called for. But the Baltimore shipyards still did business building their fast sailing boats, which could elude capture by the British Navy better than any other vessel. Even as the Baltimore traders were shipping African Americans down south, the city's maritime industry was going down, doing big business, illegally servicing the African slave trades to Cuba and Brazil with impunity. In the absence of any will to prosecute, its prolific shipyards turned out schooners with special shaped hulls for the thoroughly prohibited African slave trade, which was operating massively to Cuba and Brazil. Fernando VII of Spain, remembered as the Felon King, he dispensed with Spain's short lived constitutional government to restore more absolute monarchical power, accepted a payment of 400,000 pounds from Britain in return for criminalizing the African slave trade to his dominions as of May 30th, 1820. After he signed the compact, Spain and Britain set a mixed court up in Havana with officials from both countries to emancipate Africans captured from ships. In Brazil, the world record holder for numbers of African slaves by far, A similar mixed court of Portuguese and British was established. Fernando all but laughed in Britain's face. Cuba's prosperity, his prosperity, depended on a constant flow of slaves, with the Creole and Spanish planters of Cuba for a market. The global cholera epidemic had reached the sugar plantations of Cuba, where by 1833, thousands of slaves had died and nearly depopulated several estates, intensifying the demand for labor even as new lands continued to be converted to sugar. Participation in this trade by U.S. citizens was defined by U.S. law as piracy and punishable by hanging. But President Jackson didn't care, and he wasn't in an enforcing mood. His counsel in Havana was Nicholas Philip Trist, whose credentials, both as a Jacksonian and as a staunch pro-slavery man, were impeccable for this important patronage position. Well-educated and suavely mannered, Trist was a link between the worlds of Jefferson and Jackson. He had been tutored in law personally by his wife's grandfather, Thomas Jefferson, in their hometown of Charlottesville. He had been Jackson's private secretary in 1831 and was a lesser member of Jackson's unofficial circle of advisors that the Calhounites dubbed the Kitchen Cabinet. He arrived in Havana in 1833, the year before General Miguel Tacon became the Spanish Captain General of Cuba and remained there until 1841, bringing Virginia Jefferson Randolph Trist there to live with him. Trist, who gave slave captains of various countries permission to fly the Star-Spangled Banner, seems to have come to an understanding with Tacon. As the British captured slave ships, they sent most of those slaves, thus emancipated, to Sierra Leone. But some thousands were also brought to Havana, where they were supposedly set free. Unfortunately for them, Tacon and his colleagues, principally including monopolist fishmonger Francisco Martí, or Pancho Markey, had a business of reselling the emancipados back into slavery until the British in 1835 realized what was happening and stopped handing them over. One formerly emancipated African woman wound up being the property of Trist, who hired her out, collecting $2.50 per week for her services. Now that the slave ships were illegal pursuant to Fernando's deal with Britain, they had to make payoffs, which, it was charged, made their way up to Spanish political channels. A slaver who played the game got preferential treatment, including a privilege no one else had, to enter the harbor after dark. Tacon took a cut from the traders, reportedly a half ounce of gold per captive. Slavers could well afford the payoffs. By 1840, Cuba was producing 21% of the world's cane sugar. Trist estimated in an 1839 letter that Tacon was making more than $200,000 a year from the slave trade himself, a sum which, however respectable in and of itself, does not appear of very startling magnitude when compared to the value of 20,000 slaves, which is about the number of slaves that landed in the region. We don't have a number for what Trist made. It seems unlikely that he turned the U.S. Consul Office into a slave trading clearinghouse as purely a charitable act. But though his household finances had been damaged by Jefferson's impoverishment, he did not leverage his activities into permanent wealth. He constantly complained about his debts. He continued as a government functionary, and he was poor later in life. Working for perhaps the most anti-British president ever, he seemed to have seen his enabling activity as patriotic, pro-slavery act designed to give the British Navy as much trouble as possible. According to the British Commissioner J. Kennedy in Havana, Trist in 1836 declared he would not even open a letter from us in future. The British commissioners repeatedly complained to the U.S. government about Trist, and he was finally recalled to Washington. Horace Greeley's Anti-Slavery, The New Yorker, reported in October of that year, 1836, that Mr. N.P. Trist, consul to Havana, has been ordered home by the president to make answer for the serious accusations against him. The charge of fitting out slavers from Havana with American papers is the most formidable. After John Quincy Adams interceded, Alexander Hill Everett was sent to Havana to investigate Trist's dealings with the slave traders. What he found was shocking. Trist had been registering slavers as U.S. ships and allowing them to use the American flag along with false bills of sale and blank registries with his signature that could be filled out to show Spanish or Portuguese ownership. John Quincy Adams thought it perfectly conclusive of the guilt of Trist on conniving at aiding and abetting by all means in his power the African slave trade by the Americans, Portuguese, and Spaniards. The British Commissioner, J. Kennedy, told Everett that prior to 1836, we have no account of any vessel sailing hence under the United States flag to Africa to be employed in the slave trade. But in October of 1836, 5 American vessels left Havana for Africa a month after arriving from the United States, apparently from Baltimore, with those new schooners that they had. And they were equipped for the slave trade, carrying lumber with the crew would construct with which the crew would construct below decks level once the vessel reached Africa. 11 American flagged vessels sailed from Cuba to Africa in 1837. As it became clear that the traffic would be conducted with impunity, it picked up. In 1838, there were 19 American flagged slave ships, and in 1839, 23. The post of Portuguese consul in Havana was vacant for almost 2 years, and Trist filled in, authorizing Brazilian slave deals as well, thus servicing the 2 major African buying territories. Newly built boats sailed from Baltimore to Havana, then on to Africa, with an American captain or an American pretending to be the captain, or sometimes a foreign captain pretending to be an American, with an all Spanish or all Portuguese crew, or even an American crew, often switching flags once they arrived in Africa and took on captives. Without the American flag on the way back, the ships were susceptible to boarding and confiscation by the British Navy. But the danger of being captured before the return voyage had been eliminated, and if caught, the crews were not criminally chargeable. Only the ship and human cargo were subject to confiscation. Many traders thought the rewards great enough to justify the risk. Trist brokered a deal in 1838 for a Spanish slave trader in Cuba to buy a Baltimore schooner that sailed for Africa and was with a Spanish crew under an American flag and captain. with the name Ontario of Baltimore painted on her stern. The British captain report read, her sail was, no doubt, effected in Havana, although the bill of sale mentioned it to have taken place in Brass or present-day Nigeria. In this instance, the American flag gave unqualified protection to the slave trade. At some point, the flag was taken down, the captain apprehended, the Ontario with 220 slaves on board. She was under Spanish colors, but had no papers whatsoever. So there was this constant switching of papers and flags and documents to try to keep the slave trade going, because if it wasn't legal in one country, they just had a flag and they would fly the flag of another country so that they could continue this slave trade. General Tacon remained at his post for 15 years. The money from his wide open clandestine slave trade paid for building a building spree of historic dimensions in Havana. Adjacent to the old city in what is now called Central Havana, Pancho Marti built one of the largest and finest theaters in the world, Havana's Grand Teatro Tacon, which opened during the Carnival on February 18, 1838, with 5 floors corresponding to social classes, according to a British commissioner's report to Parliament in 1839, which said, an astonishing number of new estates have been opened throughout the island within the last 2 years. In the district of Cienfuegos, of 40 estates now working there, 27 have been of recent formation. Many new plantations have been commenced by American and even some British subjects, who will thus, of course, give considerable impetus to the slave trade by means of their capital, industry, and skill. The British Rear Admiral George Eliot, tasked with enforcing the ban on the slave trade, asked for clarification of his orders on February 6, 1839, saying, the probable object of using the American flag will be to protect the vessels up to the time of the cargo being ready for shipment. Then to go through the farce of selling the vessel to a Portuguese or a Spaniard. But in case of the capture of the vessel with slaves on board under the American flag, I should beg to know what is to be done with a man passing for the American captain. A week later, he wrote, the use of the American flag is becoming more rapidly more general in the protection of Spanish slave vessels. Eliot began capturing ships whose captains claimed to be naturalized U.S. citizens. Several of the slave dealers, he wrote, have declared their intentions to have an American sailing master in each vessel and American colors. The traders sold slaves into the Republic of Texas, which was a haven for illegal slave trading. Hugh Thomas writes that Charles David Tolmay, the British consul in Havana, in 1837 thought that 1,500 slaves might be secretly carried to Texas in the previous few years. The Virginia-born Sam Houston put a stop to that when on December 19, 1836, he signed a proclamation against the slave trade, which declared that the importation or admission of Africans or Negroes into this republic was forever prohibited and declared to be piracy, with one significant exception: if they came from the United States of America. In other words, he locked down Texas as a market for the United States domestic slave trade. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. The overall subject is the slave trade to Cuba and Brazil, but we're talking about how some of these characters acted and operated, us going back to Thomas Jefferson's grandson, who was in Brazil and was able to make a lot of money off of the slave trade because he was selling people false papers, false documents, false American citizenship. He was selling them false flags to say that they were American vessels traveling in and out of Havana, going to Cuba, going to Africa, going to get slaves. They hired crews who had the skill, knowledge, and know how to outfit the ships once they got to Africa so that they could be more suitable for slave trading. So, we're talking about how this all was impacted. The Baltimore American of July 4th, 1834, reported that a noble corvette ship, the Venus, Captain Wallace, pierced for 18 guns, built in this city on foreign account, is also ready for sea. She is, we learn, the sharpest clipper built vessel ever constructed here, and, according to the opinion of nautical men, must outsail anything that floats. Her Majesty's judge in Havana saw this item reprinted in the Diario de la Marina when the ship arrived in ballast with a cargo of bricks after making a 24-day sail from Baltimore to Havana, quoting in it a report that continued, "The Venus is destined for Mozambique and is arranged to bring as many as even as 1,000 Negroes, in which case, it is said, she would clear to the speculators from 100 to $200,000 in her first voyage. Her cash price being estimated at 50,000, and the expenses of cargo and slaves another $50,000. On the subject of vessels going equipped under the American flag to the coast of Africa, there to be pretended to be transferred for the first time to some Portuguese or Spanish owner, I have had several conversations with American consuls at this place. Trist, a gentleman of high character and considerable reading and observation. I regret, however, to say that I have received only the most discouraging replies on every point relating to the prohibited traffic. And to add that this seems to be the general feeling here of the American community. They all seem to declare that England may well think of closing up the workshops of Birmingham, where they say the bolts and shackles are manufactured, as a call on America to forbid the sailing of vessels equipped with them. In answer, I have not hesitated to express my disbelief of the shackles coming from Birmingham and to declare my full conviction that no port whatever in England would allow any such articles to be shipped. They had any idea of their being for such an intended purpose. I regret to have also to inform your shiplord that during the suspense of the Portuguese consul, as I have previously stated, the American consul has been acting pro tempore, pro tempore in that character. So they were acting on behalf of America. The cargoes, the masses of imprisoned humans down in the hold were getting larger. The Venus arrived back from Africa in Havana Harbor with 860 captives on board. Out of Havana, then, slave vessels carrying large numbers of Africans, were being run by Spanish, Cuban Creole, Portuguese, Brazilian, and United Statesman operators under the protection of the U.S. flag. So everybody had an American flag. Some returned from Africa to Cuba, others to Brazil. The British captain Brunswick Popham wrote to Admiral Elliot that he did not want to exceed his instructions by arresting an American. Feeling that I should not be borne out of interfering with a citizen of the United States, of which it appeared to me the American government evinced no disposition to tolerate, even in very extreme cases. Popham closed his letter with, "It has been mentioned by Spaniards and Portuguese slaving on this coast that were it not for the very active cooperation of the Americans, the slave trade would very materially decline. In fact, be but feebly carried on. I do not doubt from all that I hear that the citizens of the United States, generally of Baltimore, are more deeply interested in the slave trade to Havana and Brazil than is generally supposed. They were shipping out 21% of the world's population of sugar, and slaves were dying, and an epidemic had just happened, and slaves were not reproducing themselves because who, under those strenuous conditions of sugar raising, was going to feel like making more babies? So, because they were going through all these different things, these people felt it necessary to continue to import slaves illegally, switching the flags flying on ships so that because if there was a truce or a treaty with different countries, they would just let those particular countries go by without any ship checks or crew checks or any cargo checks. And that's what they used to their advantage in an attempt to continue to import more Africans from the continent. Among the papers dealing with the affair that were published as part of Van Buren's annual message at the end of 1840 was Trist's rambling defense, in which he professed indignation at the slave trade while demonstrating a close knowledge of it, and resorted to a change of subject in the classic "y'all do it too" pro-slavery trope, insulting the British for profiting off the labor of the hypothetical girl working in the Lancashire textile mills. Trist, for whom a middle school in Monroe, Louisiana is named, figures in the best known case of American slavery law from the period. He authorized the voyage of the Tocora, whose captives from Sierra Leone, which is where they were sending free enslaved people, the captives from Sierra Leone were transferred in Havana to the schooner Amistad, which coasted along toward Puerto Principe or Camagüey. The captives of the Amistad overpowered the ship and tried to sail back to Africa, but they didn't know how. The mates, hoping to have the mutineers all captured, brought the ship on a northwest course instead. They were ultimately captured by the U.S. Navy floating off Long Island, New York. The Cuban slave owners sued to have their property returned. John Quincy Adams argued the case for 2 days in 1841 before the Taney Supreme Court and won the Africans' freedom, based on the notion that the United States had no jurisdiction and that they could not have been legally enslaved. He asked the court, "My clients are claimed under the Treaty of 1795 between the United States and Spain as merchandise rescued from pirates and robbers, Who were the merchandise and who were the robbers? According to the construction of the Spanish minister, the merchandise were the robbers and the robbers were the merchandise. The merchandise was rescued out of its own hands, and the robbers were rescued out of the hands of the robbers. Is this the meaning of the treaty? Tris lost his post in 1841 with the coming of the Whigs. He faced no criminal charges for dozens of causes and cases of using the American flag to cover blatant felonious activity. So, as a country, we have a history of covering up the bull snot that people do under the color of the American flag, under the color of law, which would have made him an accessory to the slave trade that was defined as piracy by U.S. law. As Adams remarked in the Amistad argument, say it was a Baltimore clipper fitted for the African slave trade, and having performed a voyage, had come to our shores, directly or indirectly, with 54 African victims on board, and thus brought into port. What would be the assistance guaranteed by our laws to American citizens in such circumstances? The captain would be seized and tried as a pirate and hung. Tris' guilt was never proved in court, nor was he censured by Congress. Successive administrations of the United States government turned a blind eye to American involvement in the African slave trade that had reopened following the Napoleonic Wars, and did little to enforce the law against it as U.S. shipbuilders, captains, financiers, and officials all facilitated the trade to Cuba and Brazil. But these African slave ships did not come to the United States. The government did effectively police the importation of Africans to the United States because that was a protected market. So, what they're saying is that the market of slave trading in the United States had become intrastate. So within the states, they traded slaves, they bred slaves, and they created more slaves within the United States for trade within the United States. They no longer imported slaves from Africa into the United States because that would dilute the market and reduce the price of their slaves. Without that protection, Virginia's economy would probably have collapsed. James Henry Hammond of Columbia, South Carolina, noted in his diary after dining with Dr. Carter of Virginia on February 12, 1841, that he told me that in Virginia, now planters realize nothing except from raising slaves and the increase in the value of their lands in consequence of improvements from marling or spreading quicklime. Then, with a bit of a snark, he added, I suspect the rise in lands is rather imaginary. So, what he's saying is that the slave trade was the most profitable thing going in Virginia, and that they increased and estimated and got appraisals on the value of their land based on the number of slaves they could raise and based on the number of slaves they had that they were breeding. And he's saying that because they had begun to tie the value of the land to the slaves, he thought that it was imaginary that they had actually raised that much money and that much capital because it was all tied up in slaves. Heaps and Piles of Money, chapter 36, which starts on page 523, starts with a quote from Fanny Kemble, whose name is actually Frances Kemble Butler. She said, You cannot think, to return to the songs of my boatmen, how strange some of their words are. In one, they repeatedly chanted the sentiment that God made man and man makes, what do you think? Money. Is not that a peculiar poetical proposition? Pierce Meese Butler hadn't wanted his impulsive, high spirited, strong willed, self absorbed, talkative wife, Frances Fanny Kimball Butler, to come to the South, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. In late 1838, she traveled to the Sea Islands of Georgia to spend 15 disturbing weeks as plantation mistress of Butler Island. Her husband had inherited the property from his grandfather, the farmer, whose name was Major Pierce Butler. He was the father of the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, who in his day had been the second largest slave owner, which is to say, the second richest man in Georgia. So rich people have been writing our laws the entire time. Okay? Kimball was the superstar young actress who revitalized the British theater, then came to America for a year of performances in 1833 to 1834 that inspired American girls to wear their hair in Fanny Kimball curls. Butler assiduously devoted more than a year to courting the famous young woman nearly full time, which he could do because he did not work or even have an identifiable profession other than spending money. So he was upper class. He was rich because his granddaddy was rich. In spite of the sums she was earning from her performances, Kimball's finances were spread thin by her family's expenses, and the handsome, self assured Butler seemed to offer, among other things, financial stability. But then she found out what being married to a slave owner meant in the context of a 19th century marriage. Living with her husband in Philadelphia, she found that Mrs. Pierce Butler was expected to not have a stage career, publish her writing, associate with her former friends, or disagree with her husband in any way. Kimball had not declared herself to be an abolitionist before her marriage, but her diaries suggest that she made a personal connection between her condition as a married woman and that of the enslaved. She lived out her contradictions in public via her twin careers as writer and actress in one of the high profile marriage disasters of the century. Kimball had apparently believed Butler's assurances that he was one of the good slave owners. But after he became the full owner of his grandfather's Sea Island estate following the death of his brother in 1836, she saw the reality. Kimball is most remembered today for the journal of a residence on a Georgia plantation in 1838 and 1839. Her account of the months she passed there, a collection of privately circulated letters, harshly critical of slavery, she ultimately allowed it to be published in 1863 in London in the hope that it might help Britain from siding with the Confederacy. In it, to Butler's everlasting humiliation, that his wife had gone so far out of his control, she matter of factly blew the whistle on slavery as a system of concubinage and breeding. She wrote of rewards and privileges for childbearing women that were indirect inducements to reckless propagation. A woman thinks, and not much amiss, that the more frequently she adds to the number of her master's livestock by bringing new slaves into the world, the more claims she will have upon his consideration and goodwill. So she was outraged at the fact that her slaves probably had more access to her husband than she did. Kimball shared in the racism of the times, as in her ape libel description of one of the enslaved who was possessed of a beautiful singing voice, in which incidentally she references the African American use of the word brother by saying, by the by, this individual does speak, and therefore I presume he is not an ape, orangutan, chimpanzee, nor gorilla. But I could not, I confess, have conceived it possible that the presence of articulate sounds and the absence of an articulate tail should make, externally at least, so completely the only appreciable difference between a man and a monkey, as they appear to do in this individual black brother. Such stupendously long, thin hands and long, flat feet. I did never see off a large quadruped of the ape species, but as I said before, Isaac speaks, and I am much comforted thereby. At the same time, she saw the mote when it was not in her own eye, when she said, one of their songs displeased me not for a little, for it embodied the opinion that 26 black girls not make mulatto yellow girl. And as I told them, I did not like it. They have omitted it since. They desperate this desperate tendency to despise and undervalue their own race and color, which is one of the very worst results of their abject condition, is intolerable to me. Kimball was appalled by the meritorious air in which the woman always made haste to inform me of the number of children she had borne, and the frequent occasions on which the older slaves would direct my attention to their children, exclaiming, look, missus, little niggers for you and massa, plenty little niggers for you and little miss. After Butler forbade her to continue carrying him requests for better treatment from the enslaved, she received a visit from the pregnant women, whose owner she did not want to be, but whose labor supported her and provided a legacy for their own two daughters. She said, the women who visited me today were all in the family way and came to entreat me to have their sentence, what else can I call it, modified, which condemns them to resume their labor of hoeing in the fields 3 weeks after their confinement. Their principal spokeswoman implored me to have a kind of labor given to them less exhausting during the month after their confinement. I held the table before me so hard in order to not cry that I think my fingers ought to have left a mark on it. So she was conflicted in her feelings and emotions because on the one hand she thought that they were apes and orangutans, but she was surprised at how articulate the black man was that she was able to speak with. And then she felt some level of empathy towards these women who would have had to have gone back to working in the fields 3 weeks after they had the baby. Greetings, MC Nemesis Radio. The link comes up after we finish our reading, which will be in a few pages. Once Kimball saw that Butler's fortune really depended on and realized that he too had been fornicating with enslaved women, the marriage was over. Though ending it took years, created a public spectacle, and set in motion a lifelong battle for the affection of the couple's two daughters. Divorce was uncommon in those days, and the law was not friendly to it. South Carolina did not allow divorce at all until 1949. The suit was filed in Philadelphia, where state laws were relatively liberal on divorce, but the presumption was that the children belonged to the father and Butler kept the daughters. In a legal narrative drawn up for Butler by his attorneys on the course of divorce proceedings, which Butler published and circulated privately, he expressed his view of marriage as a contract between unequal partners, saying, "One reason, and perhaps the fundamental one, for the ill success which attended my marriage will readily be found in the peculiar views which were entertained by my ex wife, Mrs. Butler, on the subject of marriage. She held that marriage should be companionship on equal terms, partnership in which both, if partners agree, it is well, but if they do not, neither is bound to yield, and that at no time has one partner a right to control the other." So he thought that her ideas of equal marriage were strange. He recalled that although we resided in Pennsylvania where slavery does not exist, the greater part of my property lies in the state of Georgia and consists of plantations and Negroes. Miss Butler, after our marriage and not before, declared herself to be principle an abolitionist. But that was before Kimball Met died, who had 16 children, 14 of whom were unalive. She had had 4 miscarriages. One had been caused by falling down with a heavy burden on her head, and one from having her arms strained up to be lashed. I asked her what she meant by having her arms tied up, and she said her hands were first tied together, sometimes by the wrists, and sometimes, which was worse, by the thumbs, and that they were then drawn up to a tree post so as almost to swing them off the ground, and then their clothes rolled around her waist, and a man with a cowhide stands and strips them. I give you the woman's words. She did not speak of this as of anything strange, unusual, or especially horrid or abominable. And when I said, "Did they do that to you when you were with child?" she simply replied, "Yes, Mrs. And to all this I listen. I, an Englishwoman, the wife of a man who owns these wretches, and I cannot say that thing shall not be done again?" Greetings, Arbiter 567. I have not seen the Black Sail show. You've been watching it, and there's a character named Maxine in the Bahamas who reveals her father was a slave owner. It's really sad. That's got to be really sad. And greetings, Corey Davis 17444. I'm from Michigan, and I popped up on your timeline probably because I'm live right now. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to the chat. Once Kimball was independent, she went back to work, paying her family's expenses by giving one-woman readings of Shakespeare plays. Prices for slaves might go down, but there was also a market for them. After all, the banks had suspended specie payments, and planters by the thousands had sworn to never deal with bankers and paper money again. There were still hundreds of thousands of enslaved people whose bodies were the most reliable store of value. Because remember, The most reliable store of value was to have an enslaved person because the price may change, but it didn't go down in value like paper money. So money that you had in Pennsylvania had a different price in Texas, had a different price in New Orleans, and the banks determined the price. Everybody knew a slave was worth 500, 5,000, or whatever the price was agreed upon. And the further south you went with the slave, the more expensive the slave became. No free Black youth in the North was entirely safe from the Negro stealers. One of the best known slave narratives, meticulously adapted into an Oscar winning movie in 2013, has as its full title 12 Years a Slave, the narrative of Solomon Northup, a citizen of New York, kidnapped in Washington, D.C. in 1841 and rescued in 1853 from a cotton plantation near the Red River in Louisiana. It describes how Northup was lured in 1841 from Saratoga, New York to Washington, D.C. with the promise of work. They had work in mind for him, just not work he could get paid for. He was kidnapped and sold, becoming a captive of two slave traders infamous for their brutality. At the shipping end was James Birch of the District of Columbia, the same trader who had put Dorcas Allen and her children up for sale after protesting that he was a free man from New York. Northup received a severe beating from Birch, described in detail with the threat never again to say such a thing or he'd be unalived. I doubt not he understood then better than I did. Northup wrote, the danger and penalty of selling a free man into slavery. While imprisoned in Washington, a woman named Eliza arrived with a son, Randall, and a daughter named Emily, who recalled Northup was 7 or 8 years old, of light complexion, and with a face of admirable beauty. Her hair fell in curls around her neck, while the style and richness of her dress and the neatness of her whole appearance indicated she had been brought up in the midst of wealth. She was a sweet child indeed. The woman, also arrayed in silk with rings upon her fingers and golden ornaments suspended from her ears. Her air and manners, the correctness and propriety of her language, all showed evidently that she had sometime stood above the common level of a slave. She seems to be amazed at finding herself in such a place as that. After 2 weeks imprisoned in Washington, Northup and the pen's other captives were marched to a steamboat in the dead of night and taken down the Potomac, then transferred to stagecoaches and finally taken by rail to Richmond, where they were examined and where Northup was chained together in the pen with Robert, a kidnapped freeborn Black man from Cincinnati. They were put on an ocean-going brig that took 4 more slaves to stop at Norfolk. As they were sailing to New Orleans, Robert died of smallpox. Arriving there, they were taken charge of by Theophilus Freeman, one of New Orleans' largest slave dealers. Northup, who had contracted smallpox, was taken to Charity Hospital and managed to recuperate. Northup watched as Freeman sold Eliza's son Randall away, then sold Eliza, refusing the buyer's offer, urged by Eliza's desperate pleading to sell her daughter Emily to him as well. He would not sell her then on any account whatsoever. There were heaps and piles of money to be made of her, he said, because she was able to be a fancy girl, because she was light skinned and pretty. Remember, the fancy girls were the ones that they sold for prostitution and entertainment and concubinage. There were piles of money to be made of her, he said, when she was a few years older. There were men enough in New Orleans who would give $5,000 for such an extra handsome, fancy piece as Emily would be, rather than not to get her. No, no, he would not sell her then. She was a beauty, a picture, a doll, one of the regular bloods, none of your thick lipped, bullet headed, cotton picking niggers. She might be, if she was, he might be unalive. He might be unalived, obliterated. When Eliza heard Freeman's determination not to part with Emily, she became absolutely frantic. I will not go without her. They shall not take her from me. She fairly shrieked, her shrieks commingling with the loud and angry voice of Freeman commanding her to be silent. An unidentified, formerly enslaved man, born circa 1845, recalled, I've seen them sell women away from little children, and women would be crying, and they'd slap them about crying. Biddle's United States Bank of Pennsylvania failed in February 1841. The settlement of its outstanding liabilities on behalf of creditors took years. To try to collect on its debts, the British trustees created Bacon Trust, headed by John Bacon, which was assigned $12.5 million in assets to recover. 41% of them were in Mississippi. Remember, Mississippi was the wealthiest state during slavery. And another 30% were in New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama. Louisiana passed a measure allowing debtors to settle at 25 cents on the dollar. And Louisiana, since slaves were considered immovables, they could not be seized and sold separately. Neither of those conditions held in Mississippi, where the Bacon Trust became the biggest financier and probably ranked among the largest slaveholders in the state, says Richard Holcomb Kilbourne, who assembled its history out of a mass of archival documents. The Bacon Trust man on the ground, Joseph L. Roberts, actively managed as many as 4 plantations at a time. The value of mortgage debt, he found, was often compromised on the prior removal of the slaves, which made mortgage debts most safe. Once again, coined labor beat coined land. Roberts could not accept land in satisfaction of debts because they needed the slaves to work the land, because it was not sellable. Slaves, however, were. Negroes, he wrote, could be sold and attain the object but not the land. The Bacon Trust thus involved itself repeatedly in the person selling business. Prices were still dull, but, as Roberts wrote, good Negroes, I am told, will sell readily, although they will not bring high prices. Accordingly, Roberts accepted slaves as security, and sometimes large numbers of them, and he sold them, sometimes at sheriff sales, sometimes buying them back with on his own account. In 1846, after Roberts had taken over a Louisiana plantation from a scam artist who had run the place down, his agent reported a wretched state of things, only 53 Negroes, large and small. They received 60 Negroes with the place and their natural increase, inclusive of deaths, ought now to have made on the place at least 75 in number. Several of the Negroes now there are sickly and inefficient from overwork and exposure. Some are frostbitten, some ruptured, some branded on their hips as runaways, all without shoes, and most of them without winter clothing or blankets. The frostbitten people who were property had to be discounted by the British bank's representatives. Perhaps their fate was that nightmare of the enslaved, being sold at auction as refuse slaves. So, as you can see, the slave trade and this heaps and heaps of money that they talked about having actually came from the enslaved people. And they continued to figure out ways to make money off of the enslaved people because when the land wouldn't sell, the people could sell. When the land couldn't sell, the people would sell. And the people held all the value. And now you know that Thomas Jefferson's great grandson was complicit in the slave trade in Cuba as well. He had and was selling American papers, American flags, blank ship registers, all of this in an attempt to continue the slave trade in Havana, Cuba, and Brazil. If anyone would like to come up, the link is in the chat. But as you can see, these people continued the slave trade as long as they could in as many ways as they could. We knew that they kidnapped free people. What we didn't know is that they kidnapped free people from the continent after letting them go. So after emancipation on the islands, they diverted those ships to places where slavery was legal. And then they sent ships back to the free colonies to re enslave people. And these are the people that we're dealing with today. We're dealing with their generations. We're dealing with their grandchildren and their great grandchildren. I will be back on Thursday to read From Niggas to Gods. Hopefully, you enjoyed this reading. Hopefully, you learned something from it. Hopefully, you took away the fact that they will re enslave a free person for profit, that they will sell the American flag, the American seal, the American signatures in an attempt to validate the slave trade, that slavery was the cause of at least one divorce when one white woman found out that she was expected to share her husband with her enslaved population. And true to form, which is interesting because if they thought that the enslaved people were orangutans or apes and had tails, why were they procreating with them? Why would they do that in an attempt to make more money? Okay. They would do that in an attempt to make more money because the fruit of their loins literally became profit in their pocket. The fruit of their loins literally became profit in their pocket. So they could go and impregnate several enslaved women, and every child that they created gave them more money, gave them more capital, made them and put them in a stronger financial position. And this is what they wanted. So think about it. Let me know what you think. It's sad, but it's true. This is the world that we live in. This is the world that we inherit. These are the stories of the enslaved people. This is the heritage that we need to not lose sight of. Because if we lose sight of these stories, then we will forget who we are dealing with and we will make the wrong choice. I'll be back on Thursday reading From Niggas to Gods at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I'll be back next Tuesday to continue our reading of the American Slave Coast. I want to thank each and every one of you. I want to thank Corey Davis for being here, Arbiter 587 for being here, MC Nemesis Radio and the Forecast Radio. I know that Sister Ra and the elders are listening. I know that Moana Haguziki is listening. I know that KW Don 7 is listening. I know that MG2 is listening. I know that so many others are listening, and you. Yes, you, dear listener, welcome to the chat. If you haven't already decided to, please subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified when we're live, and leave a comment and let me know what you think. Thank you so much for tuning in. Peace, guys.